In this video, I am going to show you how to debug your Unity editor and player if you've ever been in a situation where all you do is press play and all of a sudden your log is spammed with error messages that weren't there before and you haven't made any changes to your code. So you can see right now I'm just pressing play, and suddenly my log is spammed with error messages. These are null references that are happening right here, and I'll show you how to get it to play normally and then how to reproduce this error, and then I'll show you a small sample project to reproduce this error as well. Now note that if I press play right now, then my application will run properly. And I was trying to debug this weird thing that was happening in my application where I would go into my settings and I would adjust some setting like my menu opacity here. And you can see that it's just changing the opacity, and you can see the background here behind this. And when I exit the game and I restart the game, then these changes stick and everything is fine, and that setting is saved because I'm saving it in the player prefs. So we go to the settings menu, and then you can see here that this menu is still showing up behind here. But then what I notice sometimes, and I had a hard time connecting the dots to what was happening here, is if I'm editing a prefab, I go ahead and just hit open on the prefab, and then I made some changes to that prefab, and then I just hit play without actually exiting the prefab mode, then all of a sudden my log would just be spammed with all of these error messages, and the application would basically fail to run. And then if I stopped editing the prefab and hit play, then those settings that I showed you earlier that were supposed to stay were basically getting reset, and we'll see that right here. So now I go into the settings menu and you can see that my opacity is back at the full value, and you can't see the menu that's behind here. So what is happening exactly? Let's take a deeper look, and I'll go into a really simple sample project where I can demonstrate this. So what I've done is I've created a sample project, and it's just a really simple scene. It's got 2 scripts in it and a little prefab here. So why don't we take a look at the scripts? One of them is literally just a test class. It has a string that's a message that's null by default, and make that a little bigger so it's easier to see. There we go. And then when I instantiate that test class using its constructor, then we're going to see this message change to hi, I am a message. And then in my prefab controller here, the prefab controller is the script right here that's just sitting on this prefab in the scene, and this prefab just literally contains a single slider, and that's it. So during the awake method here, you can see I'm printing the instance ID, and then I'm making a new instance of the test class, and then I'm calling my print message, which is going to show me the instance ID again. If the test class is null or not, it's going to let me know, and then it's going to attempt to print the message. So because the awake method is instantiating a new instance of this test class should definitely never be null. And when my slider is moved, then I should just be printing the message, and we should see test class is not null, and then the message shown. And I'll show you how the slider is connected as well. So if we click on the slider, you can see that I've got the on value changed is going to be calling the prefab controller .slider was moved code, and that's that slider was moved function. So the expected behavior here is that I am going to go ahead and press play, and then you'll see a bunch of messages in the console log with the instance ID and that little message. So looking back, you see that on awake, there's our instance ID, -2756, and then we print the message, test class is not null, and then hi, I am a message, and then there's all this stuff happening here every time that slider value changed, which happens, every pixel it moves basically. Then we see the same instance ID, -2756, and hi, I'm a message, and test class is not null. Now let's go ahead and reproduce the bug now. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit open, and I'm going to open the prefab here, and then I'm going to press play, and let's just see what happens. And you can see we got the first message up there. During awake, I had instance ID -2756, which was the prefab that was in the scene. Test class was not null, and I successfully printed my message. But then, all of a sudden, we see that the slider was moved, even though I didn't move the slider. And all of a sudden, test class is null, and I have a null reference on the line where I attempt to actually print the message. This line right here, because test class is null, so I cannot access the message property. So what's happening here exactly? Well, what's happening is if we click on the stack trace right here for the slider was moved, you can see that we've got this Unity engine.canvas.setWillRenderCanvases. And then all of a sudden it's moving the slider for me for some reason, and I don't really know why it seems to feel the need to do that. And then we print out the instance ID 20216, which doesn't match the initial one. So what has actually happened is when I went into play mode, the version of the prefab that was in the scene, which is this one, ran its awake method, instantiated a version of test class, and then printed the message successfully. But then for some reason, the version of the prefab that I had open in the editor context, which is a completely different instance, had its canvas updated, which somehow moved the slider. And because the slider is set to run this code right here, then it actually tried to run directly this slider was moved code on the instance of this class that existed inside the prefab, not inside the scene. And because it was the instance of this class that existed on the prefab, then the awakeNet method had not been run, because Unity's player, of course, is not going to run the awake method on this prefab instance, because this prefab instance is a different instance than the instance that's in the scene. So this can be really confusing behavior because it's totally unexpected, and it's really hard to troubleshoot, because unless you're actually printing out these instance IDs here with this get instance ID call, you would have no idea why something that you've instantiated and looked like it was fine and looked like it had been, properly instantiated, was all of a sudden null at some point later in the code. And this is why. It is because for some reason, when you have a prefab open, Unity will run a send will render canvases call to the prefab that's open when you enter play mode, and then that causes your slider to, for some reason, think that it was moved, and then execute its on value changed code, and then run basically an uninstantiated copy of that mono behavior. So what would I recommend doing about this? It can be kind of a bit of a pain if this happens to you because it can literally mess up all of the settings in your game. I'll show you in my control panel here. I have a lot of these sliders. And all I have to do is accidentally run this with that prefab open once, and suddenly it resets the value on, like all these sliders and all of these sliders and all of these sliders as well. So what I would recommend doing as a fix to this is if you have any mono behaviors that have sliders attached to them, then at some point during your awake method, and in my code here, configure is just called by awake, maybe make a variable like bool awake was run equals false, and then maybe here during your awake method, or in my case the configure method, which is just going to be called during awake anyway, then set awake was run equals true. And then on the code that's connected to your slider that gets run when the value is changed, maybe you can just do something like if awake was run equals false, then just return out and don't do anything. Because in my case, what happens is a lot of these sliders are actually connected to code in the player prefs that will actually set some floats. So you can see right here, when I slide manually my page buttons opacity slider, then I'm running this set float that's going to set a value here. But if I run this code with the prefab open in edit mode, and Unity sends that weird send will render canvases method, which calls the slider update for some reason, then I get all these erroneous values set in my code, and suddenly all my sliders have the wrong value, and resetting them back to their defaults can be a bit of a pain. So I would suggest, if you've got slider code, then do something like this, and that way if you're running an instance of that prefab, awake will not have been run, and you won't run whatever code is actually connected to that slider, and you won't basically lose your slider values that you have set in your player prefs. I know this one was probably a little bit deep. It's a weird error, and it's an error that probably not a lot of people have ever seen, because maybe not everybody is using Unity sliders and running the on value changed. But if you've ever noticed that you've got some code where changing a slider value sets a player pref, and that player pref is getting removed and your game is crashing for no good reason, then hopefully this helped you out. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you in the next episode.